Sherry, can you please tell us when it comes to definition of the word Elohim or God or and Elohim with small e or gods? Can you please give us the definition, the terms? How is this usually understood and misunderstood?
Well, first of all, I think that it might be better to start with the English term God because this is what we're familiar with. And the English word God is actually much more problematic than many of us realize because the English word God does not map one on one with the Hebrew term that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is Elohim. There are, of course, different terms used for God, such as Yahweh. We have El, we have variations of El, like El Shaddai, but there's an exceptionally common way that God is referred to. And this is how we first see him referred to in when we open our English Bibles. When we see in Genesis 1, we see the term God. That word there is Elohim. When we get to Genesis 2, God is now referred to as Yahweh Elohim. And so that's why when we turn to the next chapter of Genesis, it says Lord God, because Lord there is the word Yahweh. So we have this difference in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and some people use that as evidence of different authors. And I mean, that may be true. That doesn't actually impact biblical inerrancy at all, because the Bible's made up of a lot of different texts by a lot of different authors. And so the chapters don't have names attached to who wrote what, and they were compiled together, and so we know that they're all inspired, and the fact that it uses different terms for God is not really a problem. Actually, I think the reason we see Elohim in Genesis 1 and Yahweh Elohim, or Lord God, in Genesis 2 is probably because in Genesis 1, we have God interacting with creation in a general way. So he's interacting with all of creation. In Genesis 2, we have a very specific instance of God interacting with creation, and that is with Adam and Eve. So he's using his covenantal name in Genesis 2, which is Yahweh. So it makes sense that we see that difference when we go from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, because we're kind of zooming in on God as a covenantal being, as uh, the one that we have a genuine covenant with, like Adam and Eve are personal beings with God interacting with him. So I think one way that we can distinguish in our conversation the creator God from the lowercase gods or anything else is maybe we could call him Lord God, just like Genesis 2 does, because that's a very specific way of talking about God. There's no other uh, no other being is called Yahweh. So that's one way we could kind of distinguish the two if we're talking about it with other people. And so this term Elohim is really hard to translate because it has a very broad range of meaning in Hebrew. So it's very confusing. When you think about a language, you have words in a language, obviously, and words have ranges of meaning, right? So uh, a word can mean a lot of different things depending on the context that you're using it in, especially if you bring in things like metaphor and idiom and things like that. So what we need to realize is that the ancient person didn't think of God and the spirit realm in the same way that we do today, because we have progressive revelation, we have a lot of systematic theology and philosophy that plays into how we see God. So because of that, it's not that we're correcting earlier wrong interpretations of revelation or things like that. It's just that we know more and more as God reveals more and more of himself in salvation history, and as the world is progressing, we're knowing more, and so it makes sense that we know more about God as well as knowing more about other things. So so all that in mind, we have to try and wrap our heads around this idea of what Elohim means, because it is the most common used word in the Bible or in the Old Testament for God, but it refers to a lot of different other things. And we're not going to get into all of the specifics of what all those other things are because we're focusing on a particular comparison here. So the term Elohim is more of a term for spiritual beings. Um, so, uh, so Elohim can be God. Elohim can be uh, other spiritual beings. Elohim can even be the spirit of a human dead person because they're the ones who belong in the spirit realm. So it's more of a term about where something or where somebody their natural place to be. It's not the mortal realm; it's the spiritual realm. So our problem with trying to define this and trying to understand what an Elohim is and trying to use the word God and understand what that means is that we have the terms that we use, we have our English words, we have the Hebrew words, and then all of those things have definitions. And so what we need to kind of get into is ontology. And ontology is it's it's kind of a fancy word, but all it means is what something is. So it involves the characteristics or attributes of something. So every noun or thing has a particular ontology. So there's, attributes or potential attributes that a thing can have. And it's usually a range of characteristics, right? Like a cat is a carnivore and it usually has hair, but sometimes cats don't have hair. So, but a cat will never have a trunk or a beak. So there's things that will fit into the ontology of a thing and things that don't fit into an ontology of a thing. But when we're talking about Yahweh God, the Lord God, he's very specific because there's no one else and no other being who is like God. So he has a very unique set of attributes and characteristics that no one else is going to have. The problem is we use the word God and we map all of those characteristics onto that word God, at least when we're talking about it in the Bible. Now, we can talk about it outside of the Bible and not have a problem with the word talking about like Greek gods. It's like, well, that seems to not be a problem for people, but when we talk about the Bible, it's like you can't talk about other gods because suddenly you're mapping all of the attributes of Yahweh God onto the other beings who are known as gods. So I think that kind of trying to wrap our minds around all of these things and understand that God Himself, that Yahweh God, has a particular set of characteristics, and He has transmitted some of those characteristics to the beings He's created. Like we are like Him in many ways, and so other spiritual beings are also like Him in many ways, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the term Elohim. So Elohim is like, it's a place of residence term, as Dr. Heiser says. Um, and it's not about ontology per se. Like if I mean, it kind of is because you have to be a certain kind of ontology in order to live in the spirit realm, right? But we don't associate all of the attributes of Yahweh God to all of the Elohim because that would be ridiculous. There's no other triune being who is all powerful, uncreated, sovereign, who is the ultimate creator of all things, all of that thing. So yeah,
It's kind of like the word fish, right?
yeah,
That word is not specific to a scaled fish that has gills, although we use it that way. But originally, it was everything that lived in the ocean. So there was a specific place, orientation, dwelling place that was called fish, right? They were in water. So I think that it's a really good correlation to this word Elohim, is that you're talking about a being in a specific realm or outside of our physical realm. So maybe something encompassing our realm. And I think that works really well.
yeah, yeah. It makes us very uncomfortable to call a being like Baal or some other deity a god when we're talking about the Bible because we just assume that the word God means Yahweh God.
Yeah.
And that's why we have the capital letters and the not capital letters in our English Bibles. That's supposed to help us distinguish those things and understand that they're not the same. But that's that's a very small nuance, and it's hard to understand that.
Yeah. And translators tend to try to help us out with that, kind of like they do in the New Testament where Paul's going, and there's many so-called gods. The so-called's not there, but translators added that so that we would go, oh, we're recognizing that this word God is not being used about, omniscient,
Yeah.
omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. That's not the characteristics that you're supposed to apply to this sentence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, but at the same time, there is a bit of a distinction that we need to understand, that, all of these beings who are referred to as Elohim, they do have particular ontologies and characteristics themselves. So we have, Yahweh God, the Lord God, who nobody else and nothing else is like him. And then we have like a hierarchy of other beings who are also Elohim. And so tonight, what we're talking about is the category of being who can be called Elohim, who is who would be, I like to call them the gods of the nations, to distinguish them from the Lord God, because these are the beings who are over the nations. And we got into the last time I was on, the last time we talked about Yahweh, we got into a little bit of the divine council worldview and what it means to that God has a hierarchy, and that he separated some of his sons of God to be in authority over the other nations, and they were meant to point their people to God, and instead they took worship to themselves, and they rebelled against Yahweh by not doing his will. So that's the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and we can get into some of that if we if the conversation goes that direction. But yeah.
Paul, did you want to say something? And then after that, I can read a question.
Yeah, it's a great summary. I was just going to say kind of a two-part thing, right? For people that haven't researched this so deeply, or trying to get deeper in their Bible, right? One thing you can do is start to understand the conventions of translation and what shows up there. Like Carrie said, there's the God and the Lord God phrases that show up, and just understanding why translators put that there and what they're really representing in the original languages, right? You can kind of go back and understand what that is. The other part of that too is we kind of run into this with from a biblical standpoint, with the difference between soul and spirit, right? That it's a related. I was gonna say that Elohim you can maybe translate as spirit, but there's another Hebrew word for spirit, ruach, and it's not the same, and it's used in a specific way, but it's kind of there. It overlaps but doesn't overlap. So that's why this gets difficult. Is that well, both Hebrew and Greek are not in the same family of languages as English that we speak. So it's not, you can't do a one-to-one translation. Latin and German's a little bit easier. You still have issues there, but Hebrew and Greek, you kind of got to jump a bit. So that's why we go through this, and we're not trying to be confusing or pull things out of nowhere when we're talking about this. There is a reason for it, right?